On March 18, 2026, in the pre-dawn hours over central Israel, an Iranian Karamsha-4 ballistic missile crossed the Mediterranean sky. Israel's air defenses tracked it, the radar locked on, and then the missile did something the aero system was never fully designed to stop. At approximately 7 kilometers altitude, roughly the cruising height of a commercial aircraft, the warhead cracked open like an egg, and dozens of submunitions scattered across a radius of 8 kilometers over the Tel Aviv metro area. 2 people were killed in Ramachan, hundreds were injured, apartment buildings were shredded, and the Israeli Air Force admitted publicly that it had chosen not to shoot some of those cluster bomblets down. I want you to hold on to that word chose, because here is the contradiction that should be keeping every strategic analyst in the world up at night. Israel operates the most sophisticated layered missile defense architecture on the planet. A-2, A-3, David Sling, Iron Dome, plus a forward-deployed American THAAD battery. According to Israeli Defense Ministry figures cited by the Jerusalem News Service, the overall interception rate against Iranian missiles since February 28, 2026, stands at roughly 90%. That is, by almost any historical standard, a remarkable military achievement. The system worked, and yet on March 18, 2026, the Israeli Air Force was rationing its interceptors. A Wall Street Journal report from March 27th confirmed that Israel had begun rationing its Arrow interceptor supply. The system works, and Israel can't afford to use it. These two things cannot both be true at the same time, and today I'm going to show you exactly which one is the lie, what it reveals about the weapon Iran has actually built, and why the world was never supposed to find out. Right now, CNN, Fox News, the BBC, every outlet running a ticker about the Middle East is asking the same question. How many missiles did Iran fire? How many did Israel intercept? Did the ceasefire hold? Those are the wrong questions. The right question is this. Has Iran discovered not a new missile, but a new economic weapon? One that defeats the Arrow system, not by flying past it, but by making it too expensive to use. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you something the defense establishment has known for years in classified briefings, but almost nobody is connecting in public. I'm going to walk you through a framework I call the accountant's trap, the mechanism by which a technically inferior attacker systematically bankrupts a technically superior defender. I'm going to give you 5 specific source pieces of evidence that Iran has deliberately built this trap, that the cluster warhead is not an improvised escalation, but a carefully engineered economic weapon. And then I'm going to show you who the real winner of this exchange is. And it is not who you think, and it is not even in the room. The accountant's trap. Let me explain this from first principles, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Think about the economics of a boxing match. But instead of 2 fighters of equal size, imagine a heavyweight and a featherweight. The featherweight cannot knock out the heavyweight, not in a 100 rounds. The size difference is simply too large. But the featherweight has discovered something the heavyweight's trainer never told him about. Every time the heavyweight throws a punch, it costs him $1,000. Every jab, $1,000. Every block, $1,000. Every combination, $5,000. The featherweight, meanwhile, pays $1 per punch. So the featherweight's entire strategy shifts. He stops trying to win on points. He stops trying to land the knockout blow. He just keeps throwing punches, badly aimed, scattered, cheap, because he has done the math, and the math says the fight is already over. Eventually, the heavyweight runs out of money and cannot afford to throw back. He does not lose because he got knocked out. He loses because he got audited. That is not a metaphor I invented. That is the precise logic articulated by a defense analyst in Tel Aviv, quoted in a June 2026 piece in the Manifest Archive, who wrote, and I am attributing this directly, "Defense is more expensive than offense." That sentence is the whole war. Everything else is detail. Now, here is the academic anchor. The historical reference for this framework is Vietnam, and specifically Robert McNamara's catastrophic measurement error. McNamara, Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson, famously measured what he could count. Sorties flown, bombs dropped, body counts, hamlets secured. He built elaborate charts. He ran regression analyses. He briefed Congress with numbers that individually each told a story of American success, and he concluded America was winning. What he could not measure, and therefore chose not to see, was the economic and psychological will of North Vietnam to sustain losses that by any Western calculation should have been terminal. This is what came to be called the McNamara fallacy after the journalist and author Sidney Finkelstein popularized the term measuring the measurable, assigning precise value and treating everything unmeasurable as if it does not exist. America achieved staggering kill ratios. America achieved high rates of tactical success, and America still lost. The metric was real. The metric was just not the right metric. Okay, stay with me because this is the engine of everything that follows. The accountant's trap is the McNamara fallacy applied in reverse by an adversary who has studied the lesson. Iran is not trying to overwhelm Aero by sheer quantity. Quantity alone has never been Iran's strength against a system like Aero. What Iran is trying to do deliberately, systematically across a decade of preparation is make the act of using Aero prohibitively expensive in political, financial, and industrial terms simultaneously. And the cluster warhead is the specific instrument of that strategy. It is not a weapon in the traditional military sense. It is an invoice. Iran sends it, and Israel has to pay. The question the accountant's trap poses is not, can you intercept this? The question is, can you afford to keep intercepting this forever, faster than we can build the things you're intercepting? And that question, for the first time in this conflict, no longer has a clean answer. Here is the evidence. 5 pieces. Follow them. Number 1, the cost ratio is not a coincidence. It is a strategic design principle. A single Karamsha 4 ballistic missile, according to the Gulf Research Center's June 2025 cost analysis, sits in the 5 to 8 million bracket. That sounds expensive. Now hold that number. A single A3 interceptor costs between $2 and $4 million per round, depending on the configuration, according to multiple sourced estimates, including Israel's own unit news in April 2026. So far, so roughly equal, the attacker pays about twice what the defender pays per exchange. But here is where the cluster warhead changes the entire equation. When Iran fires a conventional Karamsha, Israel fires 1 Aero 3 back, 1 missile, 1 interceptor, 8 million out, 2 to 4 million out. That is a painful ratio, but Israel can sustain it. But when Iran fires a cluster warhead Karamsha, the same missile, the same launch cost, it releases dozens of submunitions at altitude. And now Israel has a choice. Does it fire a volley of Aero or David Sling interceptors to try to catch the submunitions after dispersal? Or does it let the bomblets fall and hope the shelter system protects civilians? There is no clean answer. The Wall Street Journal confirmed by late March 2026 that Israel had begun deliberately not intercepting some cluster submunitions to conserve its Aero inventory. The Times of Israel confirmed this on March 19th. The IDF acknowledged it openly. A $20 lock, a $4 million key. Iran figured out how to print $20 locks by the thousand. Number 2, this capability was not improvised. It was hidden, tested, and deployed in a sequence escalation ladder that lasted almost a decade. Weapons analyst Tal Enbar, who tracks Iranian ballistic missile technology on open-source platforms, documented that the Iranian submunition design visible in the March 2026 strikes had appeared exactly twice before in public at a 2016 Iranian defense exhibition displayed as a prototype and in a failed Karamsha missile test in Iran in 2023. 2 sightings 7 years apart, then silence. Then in June 2025, during Operation Rising Lion, Iran's 12-day missile campaign, the first confirmed submunition from an Iranian ballistic missile was found on Israeli soil in the town of Azor. According to reporting from India's News on Air, citing Israeli military officials and analysts at that moment were still not entirely certain which missile had delivered it. The capability was present but ambiguous. The Israelis flagged it. Amnesty International called it a violation of international humanitarian law. The international community expressed concern, and then Iran waited 8 more months. Then, in the 2026 conflict beginning on March 4th, 6 days into the war, Iran deployed cluster warheads at scale and in doctrine. First in Or Yehuda, then a second confirmed attack on March 9th affecting Yehud, Bat Yam, and Holon with human rights, Watch documenting that submunitions from what appeared to be a single ballistic missile landed across sites up to 13 kilometers apart. Then the March 17th to 18th overnight salvo, which Defense Security Asia identified as Wave 58 of Operation True Promise 4, which killed 2 people in Ramakan and drove the Israeli interceptor rationing decision that made the newspapers worldwide. According to Wikipedia's documented record of the 2026 Iranian strikes, by day 10 of the war, Iran had fired roughly 300 missiles at Israel, and nearly half carried cluster warheads. Nearly half, not a handful, not an experiment, a majority doctrine. Okay, does that sequence land? This is not an emergency adaptation to battlefield conditions. This is a capability that was prototyped in 2016, tested in 2023, previewed in June 2025 in a way designed to gauge Israeli responses, and then deployed at full operational scale in 2026 once Iran had confirmed that the vulnerability it was designed to exploit had not been closed. That is patience on a timeline that Western strategic planners who operate on 2-year budget cycles and 4-year election cycles are structurally unable to match. Number 3, the cluster warhead specifically exploits the Arrow system's geometric weakness. Here is the physics that rarely gets explained clearly. Arrow 3 is an exo-atmospheric interceptor. It is designed to kill missiles above the atmosphere, at altitudes above 100 kilometers, sometimes much higher, where the kill is clean, the debris burns up on re-entry, and there is no collateral damage to Israel below. That is the whole point of the system. It kills the threat before the threat becomes a problem, but the Khurramsha cluster warhead releases its submunitions at approximately 7 kilometers altitude. 7, not 77. That is inside the atmosphere that is below the engagement envelope where Arrow 3 operates most efficiently. Arrow can still try to intercept the parent missile before dispersal. And when it succeeds, the threat is neutralized, but the window to do so is narrow, a matter of seconds at terminal phase. And if the interception is slightly late, the cluster opens and the submunitions scatter across a 10-kilometer radius before any lower-tier system like Iron Dome can engage them effectively. According to the retired U.S. Army Air Defense officer quoted in the War Zone in April 2026, when you factor in the short flight distance from southwestern Iran to Israeli targets, the time from launch to cluster release is potentially as little as 1 to 2 minutes at terminal phase. 1 to 2 minutes. That is not a targeting problem. That is a physics problem. Iran built a weapon that exploits the geometric gap between Israel's upper-tier and lower-tier defenses. The choke point is not a missile. The choke point is a 7-kilometer altitude window that the entire Arrow system was not optimized to close. Number 4, the interceptor stockpile problem is now a documented budget crisis inside the Israeli defense establishment. And the paper trail on this is extraordinary. Here is the number that should have made every front page and did not. According to the Arms Control Wonk analysis tracking interceptor expenditures in the June 2025 conflict, the United States THAAD battery deployed in Israel fired between 100 and 150 THAAD interceptors during the 12-day war. Each THAAD interceptor costs approximately $12.7 million according to the FY 2025 Missile Defense Agency budget. The FY 2026 production budget, the full year projects only 32 new THAAD interceptors. 32, not 320, 32. The United States fired more than a full year's worth of THAAD production capacity in 12 days. That is not a supply chain stress. That is a supply chain rupture. And then 6 months later, Israel and the United States started the 2026 war with whatever had been reconstituted in the interim. The A3 numbers tell the same story in a different register. A single A3 interceptor cost between $2 and $3 million, according to the Times of Israel and Walla News, with production timelines of several months per missile. Exact timelines classified for security reasons. In December 2025, Israel signed a deal worth billions of shekels with Israel Aerospace Industries to expand production. 6 weeks later, in January 2026, Germany signed a $6.5 billion follow-on a 3 contract, partly because Berlin wanted more interceptors for its own defense, and partly because the contract helped fund IAI's production expansion. And then the war started on February 28, 2026. and the stockpile that had just been ordered began depleting faster than the production line could replenish it. This is the part that a Walla News investigation in April 2026 documented with remarkable clarity. The decision to dramatically accelerate A3 procurement, the emergency approval that Defense Minister Katz ultimately announced on April 6th, had been delayed for months because of a budget dispute between the Defense Ministry and Finance Ministry, a dispute during the war. Missiles falling on Dimona, on Haifa, on central Tel Aviv, and the Finance Ministry and Defense Ministry were in a standoff over how to fund the accelerated interceptor order. According to the Walla investigation, Defense Ministry Director General Amir Bahram, IAICEO Boaz Levy, and Missile Defense Organization head Danny Gold all had to personally underscore the urgency of the decision to break the deadlock. 3 senior officials publicly lobbying their own government to fund its own defense while a war was in progress. That is not bureaucratic friction. That is the accountant's trap operating inside the Israeli state itself. Iran did not even have to pressure the Israeli Finance Ministry. The cost ratio did it automatically. Number 5, Iran showed this weapon to the world in June 2025 and was not stopped, which is the most important data point of all. The first confirmed use of an Iranian cluster warhead on Israeli soil came on June 19, 2025. According to Israeli military officials quoted by India's News on Air, Amnesty International called it a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. The international community expressed concern, and then 8 months later, Iran did it again at scale systematically as the cornerstone of its missile strategy in the 2026 war. Because the answer in those 8 months was not a solution to the geometric vulnerability. The answer was more Arrow production orders, more conversations about A4, more budget debates. Iran saw the window and concluded it would still be open, and it was right. Now, let me give you the strongest possible argument against everything I've just said. I want to be honest about this because intellectual honesty is the only thing that makes this kind of analysis worth anything. The counter-argument is this. Israel's interception rates remain historically extraordinary. 90% is not failure. The Israeli Defense Ministry, cited by GNS in February 2026, estimated that $50 billion in potential damage had been saved by the Arrow system. 24 civilians were killed across 40 days of missile warfare involving 650 Iranian missile attacks. A tragedy certainly, but remarkably limited lethality given the scale of the bombardment. The cluster warhead, by most military assessments, is not a war-winning weapon. It terrorizes, it strains, it creates noise, but it does not destroy armies or take territory. And Arrow 4, according to Israel Aerospace Industries CEO Boaz Levy, speaking at a Tel Aviv defense conference in February 2026, is approaching operational service designed specifically to counter maneuvering re-entry vehicles and the kind of split warhead threats Iran has now deployed. That is a serious argument. I want you to hold it in mind. But here is what it cannot explain. It cannot explain why the Israeli Air Force was rationing interceptors during a live conflict. A 90% interception rate that you cannot financially sustain is not 90% protection. It is a countdown. It cannot explain why the Finance Ministry and Defense Ministry were deadlocked over Arrow production funding while missiles were actively falling on Israeli cities. It cannot explain why, by half of the missiles Iran fired in the 2026 war carried cluster warheads, according to Wikipedia's documentation of the 2026 Iranian strikes, suggesting that Iran has industrialized this capability, not improvised it, and it cannot explain the single most uncomfortable fact of this entire conflict, which is that the Arrow system's greatest technical achievement, intercepting outside the atmosphere to minimize collateral damage, is precisely the geometry that Iran's cluster warhead is designed to exploit. The strength of the system is also its vulnerability. That is not a problem Arrow 4 fully solves unless Israel can intercept every Khorramshahr at exo-atmospheric altitude before dispersal, which requires near-perfect early warning and perfect intercept geometry every single time. And perfection in warfare is not a strategy, it is a prayer. Let me bring this all together. What Iran has built with the cluster warhead Khorramshahr is not a new missile. It is a new economic weapon. It exploits the cost asymmetry between offense and defense. A Karamsha at 8 million versus a volley of Arrow and David's sling interceptors, whose combined value can exceed the missile they're chasing. It exploits the geometric gap in Israel's layered defense. The 7-kilometer altitude window between Arrow's optimal engagement zone and a dispersal point of the cluster payload. It exploits the political vulnerability of a democracy. The finance ministry that will not fund interceptor production fast enough. The public debate about rationing. The Wall Street Journal story about stockpile depletion that Iran's planners absolutely read. And it exploits time because Iran hid this capability for a decade, revealed it gradually, and forced Israel to fight a war whose central defensive challenge had no clean solution on the day it began. The McNamara fallacy says, count what you can count and declare victory. The accountant's trap says, count what your enemy is counting because that is the real battlefield. Iran is not trying to shoot down Arrow. Iran is trying to make Arrow too expensive to keep firing. And as of March 2026, that strategy was documented, confirmed, and working. Now here is the player nobody is talking about, China. While the world watches the Arrow system strain under Iran's cluster barrage, China is sitting at a table it did not set and eating a meal it did not cook. According to a Small Wars Journal analysis published in March 2026 by Dr. Tahir Mahmoud Azad and corroborated by reporting from Special Eurasia in March 2026, Beijing has provided Iran with access to the Beidou 3 navigation satellite system, China's GPS equivalent, enabling Iranian missiles to navigate with precision even when the United States activates GPS jamming, a tactic that degraded Iranian accuracy during the June 2025 12-day war. Before Beidou access US jamming was one of the hidden variables suppressing Iranian accuracy. After Beidou, that variable was neutralized. China provided the technology. Iran fires the missiles and China pays no price. But that is only half of what China collects. According to the Special Eurasia Intelligence Analysis from March 2026, every Iranian missile exchange with the Arrow system is a live test of American and Israeli air defense architecture that China has no other way to observe. Where does Arrow fail? What altitude triggers interception? What electronic signatures precede a launch? How does that integrate with Arrow in real engagements? China's military planners, who are designing their own anti-access and area denial systems for potential Taiwan scenario, are watching the most expensive live fire test of Western missile defense in history, and they are watching it for free. China provided the navigation technology, Iran ran the test, and China is collecting the data. The patient giant does not fight the war. The patient giant reads the board, offers just enough support to keep the test running, and walks away knowing exactly which card to play when its own moment comes. China has spent nothing on interceptors. China has lost no soldiers. China has fired no missiles. And China may have learned more from this conflict than any participant in it. 3 things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours and beyond as this conflict evolves. Watch the Israeli Arrow 4 timeline. Israel Aerospace Industries CEO Boaz Levy said in February 2026 that Arrow 4 was approaching operational readiness. The question is whether its design specifically addresses the 7 kilometers altitude cluster dispersal problem, because if it does not, the accountant's trap simply resets at a higher cost per exchange. Watch the public statements coming out of MAFAT, the Israeli Missile Defense Administration, for any language about engagement altitude thresholds. That language will tell you whether Arrow 4 is a solution or a more expensive version of the same problem. Watch the Chinese Beidou access question. In early 2026, U.S. officials confirmed they were examining fragments from Iranian missiles to determine whether Chinese origin components were present. According to IP Defense Forum reporting from April 2026, if the investigation produces public attribution linking Beidou-guided Iranian strikes to concrete targeting improvements, it changes the diplomatic calculus between Washington and Beijing in ways that the current ceasefire has temporarily papered over. Watch whether the State Department says anything that rhymes with dual-use technology transfer in the next several weeks. And watch the interceptor production numbers. Israel approved accelerated Arrow 3 production with an expanded contract with Israel Aerospace Industries in April 2026, confirmed by the Times of Israel. The question is not whether they ordered more missiles. The question is the production lead time several months, as the Times of Israel noted. If the ceasefire phrase before that production cycle completes, Israel re-enters the next exchange with a depleted stock. Watch the Israeli Defense Ministry's language about endurance versus sufficiency. Sufficiency means you have enough now. Endurance means you are worried about a long war. That distinction matters. Your homework: pull up two documents and put them side by side. First, the Gulf Research Center's June 2025 analysis, the price of escalation accounting for the military cost of the 2025 Israel-Iran conflict. It itemizes the cost per interception at each layer of Israel's defense stack. Second, pull up the arms control wonk analysis from June 2025, exhaustion and inflection estimating interceptor expenditures in the Israel-Iran conflict. It tracks estimated A3 and THAAD expenditure against known annual production rates. Read those two documents together. Put the cost of each intercept on one side, put the production capacity on the other, and then tell me in the comments, is Israel winning this economic war, or is the accountant trap already closed? I genuinely want you to challenge this analysis. If I'm wrong about the economics, prove it. Show your work. The best counter-argument I've read this week, the one that makes me actually revise, comes from this community, not from think tanks. There's a question I keep returning to at the end of all of this, and I don't have a clean answer to it. If the Arrow system works 90% of the time and 90% is not enough, does the problem lie in the weapon or in the economy of the civilization that built it? Because the cluster warhead did not defeat Israel's technology. It found a seam between the technology and the budget. And the budget is a political artifact. It is a product of finance ministries arguing in real time of production timelines stretching across multiple election cycles of a democracy's inherent difficulty in spending money on a problem that is only lethal 10% of the time. The question is not whether the Arrow system is good enough. The question is whether any open society can afford to run a defense system at the cost ratio this conflict has revealed indefinitely against a patient adversary who needs only to keep the math running in its favor. Who wins a war where the defender can't afford to win every battle? I'll see you in the next one.